Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Jan Keller from 350 Seattle, and I'm so glad to see you all, and we have a great evening in store for you. We're going to be talking about two issues that are really important right now. One is the TPP, or Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the other is a carbon tax idea for Washington. 350 Seattle, which is putting on this event, is part of a global grassroots movement to working on protecting the climate and bringing down the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from 400 parts per million to 350, which is a much safer level. So I'm very pleased to introduce Randy Mandell. He is a 350 Seattle member who's been working to get big money out of politics. He is passionate about helping people see how the important things they're organizing around could be impacted by political, economic things like the TPP. So I will turn it over to Randy.
So my talk, as said, is on the Trans-Pacific Partnership and climate change. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is also known as the TPP, and this is a secret international agreement the U.S. is negotiating with a number of Pacific Rim countries, and should it pass, it'll set in motion a lot of negative effects, including restricting our ability to deal with climate change, and that, of course, is our focus. So I want to start by making a few preliminary comments about the environment, the climate. Currently, CO2 is 400 parts per million in our atmosphere, and that is not acceptable. At numbers over 350, the Earth will tend to auto-warm, and this can set in motion two types of tipping points, some that increase warming and some that can cause serious and possibly abrupt ecological changes, which will make it difficult for humans and other life forms to exist on the planet. So it's important that we get back to the safe level of 350 as soon as possible. Now, it's possible, if we go at this very hard, to get down to that level by the year 2100. If we waited even till 2020, when the carbon level was higher, we wouldn't get to 350 till 2300. Now that 200-year delay means more suffering, more deaths, and frankly opens the door to catastrophe, so it's extremely important we get going sooner. If we wait longer or till the carbon's at a higher level, well, that's a conversation we don't want to have. To get to 350 soon, we're going to need the type of legislation to force the United States to begin transitioning to a green economy, and we're going to also have legislation to force a decrease in fossil fuel emissions by 6% per year if we had started in January. Now, this is world totals. We're a little bigger emitter than some countries, so we're going to have to cut back a lot more. We're also going to have to sequester 100 gigatons of carbon. That's a big part of it, and to do that, we're going to have to plant 1 trillion trees by 2020. And if we do all these things, we can still get to 350 essentially by the end of the century. Now, this is a very big undertaking, and it's urgent, and therefore it's important we make sure there's nothing that can sabotage our efforts that we don't identify with now and go after, because if we're a couple years down the road and realize we overlooked something important, that's obviously going to be a big problem. And one of the things that's kind of been slipping under the radar is this thing called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the TPP. Now, they're trying to sell this to the American public to the degree they're discussing as a trade agreement. There's a little bit of truth to that. Of the 29 chapters, 5 of them are about trade, but that leaves quite a few other chapters. The most significant one is called the Investor Rights Agreement. That's the most toxic one, and that's the one we're going to talk about. The reason they call it a trade agreement is, one, they absolutely don't want to discuss the Investors' Rights Agreement, and two, they have to pretend it's about trade, because that means it's about jobs, with the implication that it's going to be good for jobs, which sort of ignores the history of trade agreements rather generally, but that's another topic. The way they sell the investor rights is very much the way cigarettes sell cigarettes. If you look at the ads, what cigarette companies typically sell is sex. People like sex. However, if you open this container, this carton, there actually isn't any sex in there. What's in there are heart attacks, strokes, cancers, and for men, risk of impotence. But those are difficult to sell to the American public. So what they have to do is completely conceal the real contents and sell you a fantasy. And that's exactly how they're selling the investor rights agreements of the TPP. What are investor rights? This gives corporations the rights of sovereign nations. Big deal. So if you're a US corporation doing business in Canada, and Canada passes a law, say to protect the environment, that in complying with you would lose profits, you can sue them for the lost profits. And the lawsuits can be in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and actually in Europe into the billions. And you tell Canada, listen, you can take your law away, or you can pay me this large sum of money. It essentially gives the corporations the opportunity to veto laws they don't like. That's what this comes down to, a corporate veto. Now, let's say a US corporation decided to file that lawsuit. Do they file it in a US court or a Canadian court? Well, the answer is neither. They're setting up a corporate court, and that's the only place you can hear these cases. This is set up under the language of these investor right groups by the corporations, for the corporations, and given this whole thing is set up to veto laws they don't like, you can make a pretty good guess what happens in these corporate courts. These corporate courts are a privatized court system that in some ways can rival the power even of the Supreme Court. And remember, at least in the civis classes, American law is based on a whole history of laws that went through the legislature. There's no precedence or any legal basis like that for this. This basically comes down to corporate profit. They're decided in arbitration bodies in places like the World Bank with no accountability and no visibility. And the judges can at one time be a judge, and then a lawyer, and then back to being a judge, and back to being a lawyer. There's concerning evidence coming out in Europe that some of the legal firms that are doing these arbitration cases and are helping to write some of these laws want to expand the scope of these courts. The more cases and for the higher settlement that are going to these courts, the more money they make. And there's even evidence some of the corporate sector, including Wall Street, is encouraging this process. Very sobering. Now, what TPP wants to do is take investor rights already established and expand them. Let's look at where it started, because that's bad enough, and we certainly don't want it expanded. So I'm talking about the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and it had an investor rights chapter, Chapter 11. There's no history of TPP because it hasn't passed, and it'd be good if we kept it that way, but there is a history for NAFTA, Chapter 11. One of the early cases is as follows. There's a fuel additive, MMT, you can add to fuel to make the octane level higher. The bad news, it's neurotoxic, and it interferes with pollution control equipment in cars that is there to lower greenhouse gas emissions, and the law was put in place to protect climate change. The US corporation said, but wait, if you ban it, I'm going to lose profits, and filed a $250 million lawsuit in corporate courts for Canada considering the law. Since it's going into corporate court, Canada, kind of seeing the handwriting on the wall, withdrew the case and gave the corporation a $13 million check for their inconvenience. Moving to the present, I hope everybody saw the excellent movies Gasland and Gasland 2. If you did, you know fracking is not the safe, clean fuel it's advertised. It also is going to waste a great deal of water. It also pollutes groundwater and drinking water, so much so that people have had their drinking water contaminated such that they can light their water on fire coming out of their faucet. That's water that people were supposed to drink, including, say, pregnant women. So in Quebec, there was plans to frack along the St. Lawrence River, and Quebec put a moratorium saying they wanted to study the health impacts before we went further. Apparently, the people in Quebec didn't want their drinking water catching fire. People can be picky that way. And the corporation filed a $250 million lawsuit basically saying, take that law off the book or pay us $250 million. This is the cover for the actual lawsuit. And the language is revealing. They point out that stopping to study the safety of fracking and delaying it would be an arbitrary, capricious, and illegal revocation of their rights. Illegal? The implication seems to be that a democratic decision to study something safely is illegal, which would imply, at least to some people, democracy itself may be becoming illegal. TPP is intended to expand these investor rights. There's also language in there to make it much more easy to export natural gas, including, so the way it will work is, if you're exporting the gas to a country you have a free trade agreement with, basically no oversight, and you can export pretty much at will. If you look at the prices of natural gas in Asia, you can quickly see there's going to be an avalanche, an attempt to start fracking and exporting that gas, which also will release a great deal of methane into the atmosphere. They have investor rights agreements in Europe. I'll just touch on two. One, there was an effort to put restrictions on coal-fired plants in Germany for obvious reasons, and a Swedish company filed a $1.9 billion suit. Eventually, Germany had to make a settlement and weaken the environmental laws. Remember, these are vetoes. After Fukushima, for some reason, the people in Germany decided to phase out nuclear power and go with renewables. I don't see any reason why this would be different if they were phasing out fossil fuels. The Swedish company with an interest in the nuclear plant filed a $4.6 billion suit. Pay us $4.6 billion or take your law off the books. Put it on your calendars. We may need to come back next year and do this talk again. The United States is now negotiating the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, which is basically TPP for Europe and the United States, which is also aimed to weaken food safety laws and environmental laws. Another scary thing about TPP, it has a docking clause. This is new. That means if it's passed without congressional oversight, other countries can simply join the dock, namely every country. The US has pointed out this could be the last investor rights they have to negotiate, because technically every country could join this. The TPP is being negotiated in secret. Basically, the corporations are writing the laws themselves. Wall Street is writing the laws that will not allow them to be regulated, Monsanto on food safety, Halliburton on energy, straight down the list. And they're not even letting a lot of the congressmen have access to this. And those that have seen it have to swear an oath of secrecy that they can't tell us. In fact, the language is such that the American people can't know the details of TPP until 4 years after the agreement. I don't remember if anyone knows what democracy is supposed to mean, but this is extremely important. Now, when I say no one can see this, I am exaggerating. These people can see it. The heads of Halliburton, Chevron, and GE. They not only can see it, they're writing it, and not even allowing Congress full access to it. It's concerning as we face such climate disaster that we should notice that American democracy is actually melting faster than the glaciers. Now, this is both a bad news, good news slide. The bad news is TPP is even worse than what I said. The good news, it affects so many people that coalitions are coming together to fight back. And let me give you one more good news. The first time they tried to expand investor rights after NAFTA was the multilateral agreement on investing. And the corporate world said, there's nothing you can do about this. And we beat it. And we can beat this one too. Now, it's the bad news, good news. In addition to what TP does to the environment, it's going to curtail internet freedom. It's going to block buy local and buy American, which is a problem when we go for green environment. It's going to phase out generics and raise drug prices. It's going to make it easier to offshore jobs. It's going to limit the regulation of Wall Street, including preventing regulating derivatives and putting a speculation tax. That's the Robin Hood tax or Tobin tax you hear about, blocked. And it's going to be harmful for food and safety regulations. And I thought I would just mention, in addition to weakening standards for importing meat, it's going to limit inspection of fish. Now, this is a Pacific treaty. Fukushima is dumping tons of radiation into the water right now, probably at its highest rate, and with the worst days still to come. And fish in that area have radioactivity that is pretty much off the charts. So this is kind of an important issue. This is an artist's conception of the TPP. And the question is, what is the TPP? And it turns out it's everything but D. There's no extra strength toilet paper in the treaty, so no redeeming features. And I think the artist pretty much has the essence of it. The good news is people are not taking this sitting down. People are rising up in protest throughout all the TPP countries and the United States. We're being led in Washington by the Fair Trade Coalition. There's Public Citizen, there's the Sierra Club, there's the unions, there's Occupy, there's Get Money Out of Politics, there's the Solidarity Movements, and this is going throughout the TPP region. And if our voices can be raised in the next month, we can still win this. Very important to focus that we're in this to win. The next big step is fast track, and this is where you have to focus. There are two ways they can bring TPP for ratification to the Congress. One, they can just bring it there and say vote. That means there's debates and amendments. And someone can say, this is going to put dairy farmers out of business, as it will, family owned, and that's our constituents, we want that changed. And someone can say, our constituents want changes around the environment or around prescription drugs. And someone may notice, Australia is saying they will join the TPP only if the investor rights chapter doesn't apply to them. That's not a bad idea if people knew about it. And if you bring it up for debate and amendments, one, it's going to be impossible to pass, and two, albeit at the last moment, the truth is starting to come out to the American people because a few brave people bringing up these points illuminate the process. And since it was conceived in secrecy and negotiated in secrecy, they want to pass it in secrecy. What fast track means is the following. If Congress votes fast track authority to the president, he can complete the negotiations and bring it to Congress for a simple yes or no vote, no discussion, no amendments, and no one finds out what's in it. If Congress votes for fast track, what they're saying is, please handcuff me. I want you to handcuff me. So when the vote comes later, they can say, don't blame me, I was handcuffed. It's a little insulting. What we need to do to fight back, first and foremost, is get to know what the TPP is. On the 350 Seattle website, we have a lot of information, including some good videos, particularly from Public Citizen and Sierra Club. Please view these and pass these out to everybody, not just in Seattle and not just in Washington. We need to set a chain reaction across the country. We need to contact everybody we know. We need to make sure 350 in Washington and around the country understands the implication, and we need to make sure that the other environmental activists, and we're talking to all the environment activists we know, understand what's at stake. Then you got to call your Congress. And remember, vote early and vote often. We've got to blow their phones off with the simple message that we don't want fast track. There already is the DeLauro letter asking them not to approve fast track. Here's what's going to happen when you call them. They're going to say, we're concerned about the environment, but we're concerned about jobs. Don't get sucked into that. The issue is democracy and transparency. This has been negotiated in secret. Your representatives who need to consult you and get your input aren't allowed to even show you it. If you call them and ask them to send you the documents, they won't. And by the way, you should ask for them. Your congressman may not have seen it, and they're not allowed to see one word of this, but they're going to vote fast track, which basically means this whole thing can pass without anyone knowing about it. You need to let them know that in a democracy, this is not acceptable. If we can't know about it, they can't vote. We need hearings, we need discussion, and you need to hold them accountable. This is one vote I wouldn't forget, and I'd make sure they know that. We need to adopt what's called the Dracula strategy. The idea being TPP, like Dracula, won't survive long in the sunshine. And as climate change activists, we need to keep fossil fuels underground. And to do that, we're going to first have to reach underground and pull this goddamn TPP out for all to see it in the sunlight. And in the process, reaffirming once again the power of solar energy. Thank you.
Do we have any questions for Randy?
Randy, I got to wondering when you were talking about Congress and fast track, do you happen to know what McDermott's position is on this, and also Murray and Cantwell?
I believe what I've heard is McDermott says he wants transparency. I'm not as optimistic at the present as some of the others, but I don't think anyone's heart is in supporting fast track, and I think with pressure things can change. But that's what I know so far. And before I go on, I want to say two things. I forgot, I was trying to be under time. Val has a bunch of handouts about other ways to put pressure on TPP, and I would please get those before you leave. The other thing is, in addition to beating TPP, we also have to plant 1 trillion trees. And Michael Foster is the first U.S. group that's trying to get those trees planted,
Michael, would you raise your
involving
hand?
schools, children, a super important thing. And it's real important to talk to him as well, because that's also very important work.
I'm kind of shocked by what you said about what's going on in Europe. Are you saying that this is an agreement that's already in place, and that's where the German cases are coming from?
There are other agreements of investor rights in Europe. The one that I discussed, the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, is just being discussed. That's still early on, and it's a long ways to go, but there already are other free investor rights agreements in Europe, and that's what those cases were based on, yes.
So there actually is a court in Europe that's looking at these cases?
That's my understanding.
Particularly with regard to the sovereignty issues, this seems to be a matter that would cross party lines. Is there any evidence of that?
I don't know the answer to that. Remember, no one's seen the documents, so I don't think we put the pressure on yet to really know where people are. And I think until they're pushed, I don't think we know. But unfortunately, I'm not the one to ask that question. The person to ask actually was called away for a meeting, so they're not here. But again, the corporate power is such that most people are going to have a lot of push to support this. The question is, how much pushback are they going to get? And that just remains to be seen. And I really apologize for not mentioning this. Fast track vote was scheduled for October. Now, there was reason to think that was going to get pushed back. There's now reason to think it's going to get moved up. The reason Kristen isn't here is there's a chance the current round of negotiations may be the last one, and that's going to mean they're going to be coming to a vote a lot sooner than expected. So right now, assume fast track is in October, could move to late September. So we're kind of in that final push where you really got to let them know. And until we do that, we don't know where they are, but we need to hold them accountable. So remember, go hard for 4 to 5 weeks. This is a very big moment. And if they hear from us hard in the next 4 to 5 weeks, it could make a difference. So that's important.
Could you reflect the position of the administration to even go along with this? I don't understand how you would give up this quantity of rights and yet for trade alone. I mean, what is the pressure that the current administration feels?
Obviously, corporate support. I can't speak in the specifics. Remember, NAFTA was originally proposed during Reagan and Bush 1, and it was pushed through by Clinton. And the MAI, which would have expanded that, was also attempted by Clinton. Now, this TPP was started by George W. Bush, and when Barack Obama took office, he said he wasn't going to do this. Now, what pressure was brought to bear on him, I can't speak to, but he's completely reversed his position, and he's pushing hard for this. That's just a fact. As far as what the pressure is behind the scenes, I don't know, but you still have to know that's where it's at.
Hello. You said that the United States is negotiating this. What is the United States? Then you said it was all these corporations. What part of the United States is doing this?
Well, I think you probably said it. The United States is negotiating this, and I believe it's through the executive office, but it's basically being conducted by the corporations, which kind of gets to the question you were asking, but, or maybe it didn't.
If it's all so secret, how come you know?
So the reason, it's a good question. The investor rights chapter was leaked. It was never intended to be released. It was leaked. And people close to negotiations say they've talked to people and there's no real changes. But most of this is not being released. So we know what's going on, and they tell us it's about jobs, But it's a secret in the sense the text is not released and is not supposed to be released until 4 years afterwards. So it's not a secret that it's happening, it's just a secret of the content, which is really what matters. So what's known as either leaks or people talking, which they're not supposed to be doing. But if you call your congressman and say, send me the language, they can't. They don't have it, and they're not allowed to send it, and it's a good exercise to call them and ask them to send it to you. But again, what we know is due to leaks. So it's a secret, but we know it because of leaks only.
So just briefly, I believe it is the United States State Department that's the actual body of government that's participating in this negotiation. Yeah, the U.S. Trade Representative, which is part of the State Department.
Have you heard of any talk of legal challenges to this if this did go through? I mean, it seems to me there would be a myriad of legal arguments as to why it's unconstitutional.
That's what I would think. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so Chapter 11 NAFTA already has all this, and I'm not aware of any issues. Somebody I respect very dearly suggested that the corporate court would trump even the U.S. Supreme Court. And the question is, does the U.S. Supreme Court have the right to hear the constitutionality of this? And that's a legal question that I think is super important. I don't know the answer. But certainly there's no challenge been made to NAFTA Chapter 11, and certainly we wouldn't want the current court to make that decision anyway. But I don't know what the status of trade agreements are and whether there's something the Supreme Court could hear. I don't know that, and that's a super important question, and one I want to ask a good lawyer. That's not me, though. But I think it's a great question.
I want to send out an email to everybody on my list. I don't want to sound like a nut job. I don't want people to stop getting my emails because they don't want to hear from this conspiracy nut. How do I do that? How do we bring this out into the light without sounding like we're conspiracy theorists?
Well, one thing I was suggesting, a little joking, but I actually like it, is talk to your friends about this. If you're like me, most of your friends are well-meaning, but they're going to think this is crazy. So you tell your friends, well, do you think you could call your congressman and they'd send you a copy of the draft? If they say, oh, sure, I know we could, bet them dinner at a nice restaurant. Make them make the call, make them get pissed off, and then, of course, they owe you dinner. Bet 10 friends, get 10 dinners. You can talk to them about climate change and TPP, and then tell them if they want to be more a part of the solution, they can go out and bet 10 friends of their own. The key thing is, will your congressman send you the documents? If they don't believe you, bet them. Make them follow through. And then when they lose and you're having dinner, order wine, mention you've won 10 free dinners, and tell them they can go out and get 10 more of their own. I think that's one approach. We have to be creative, but that's a suggestion.
So what is their rationale for keeping the agreement, the negotiations so secret?
Well, I don't know what the rationale is, but I mean, the answer is pretty obvious. They're not going to pass this if anyone knows what it is. I don't know what I don't think anybody's asking. The idea is it's not in the newspapers. Very few people know about it. I mean, you can find out about it, but they're not making that easy for you. I don't know what the rationale is, but it's pretty obvious they don't want you to know. I mean, if they won't release the text for 4 years after it's done, I think that says it.
Find it. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Randy.